Buenos días. Estamos en la charla inaugural del segundo semestre del ciclo lectivo en la Universidad de Costa Rica, específicamente del Centro de Investigación en Comunicación, y la directora del centro, Janet Martínez, creo que va a dar unas palabras iniciales para comenzar con esta actividad. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros hoy.
Buenos días a todas y todos. Desde el Centro de Investigación en Comunicación de la Universidad de Costa Rica, es un gusto que estén conectadas y conectados desde diferentes lugares de América Latina y desde otros lugares. Así que le damos la bienvenida virtual a esta actividad, a nuestra charla inaugural del segundo semestre, con el doctor Marcus Gilroy-Ware y con la participación también del doctor Ignacio Siles, coordinador del programa de investigación, prácticas de desarrollo y apropiación tecnológica del CICOM. Para nosotras y nosotros es un gusto que el doctor Marcus Gilroy pues esté acá, y pues sin más les dejamos el espacio a Ignacio para las presentaciones, y esperamos que esta charla sea de mucho provecho y abra puertas para el debate regional sobre el tema. Muchísimas gracias. Adelante.
Bueno, me toca a mí el privilegio de presentar al profesor Marcus Gilroy-Ware, quien es profesor en la Escuela de Cine y Periodismo de la University of the West of England, donde dirige el programa en producción de medios y enseña sobre derecho y medios de comunicación. Su recorrido profesional y académico da cuenta de la diversidad de fuentes que nutren su trabajo y su pensamiento. No solo es investigador de la tecnología, sino que también es creador de ella. Por ejemplo, el profesor Gilroy-Ware tiene experiencia en el desarrollo de apps para la gestión de proyectos. A esto se le suman otras trayectorias profesionales y personales. De base, el profesor es lingüista, graduado de un programa de pregrado en ciencias cognitivas. También tiene una maestría en Derecho de la Universidad de Londres, y de hecho esa intersección entre lo tecnológico y lo legal es una de las áreas que más le interesa. Y finalmente, según sus propias palabras, el profesor Gilroy-Ware es músico, y tal vez por su nombre de pila podrán adivinar cuál es su instrumento preferido. Todas estas trayectorias se combinan en el trabajo de Marcus Gilroy-Ware para producir una de las interpretaciones más originales, me parece a mí, que existen hoy en día sobre temas de tecnología y cultura. Esta originalidad se aprecia muy bien en sus dos libros publicados, en Filling the Void, Emotion, Capitalism and Social Media, que fue publicado en 2017. Marcus critica la explotación que las redes sociales hacen de nuestras vulnerabilidades psicológicas, y de forma más profunda, el libro conecta esa búsqueda de felicidad en redes sociales que tenemos con la condición actual del capitalismo. Más recientemente, en 2020, publicó After the Fact, The Truth About Fake News, un libro que de algún modo le da continuidad a su primer proyecto. Este libro, que hemos estado de hecho leyendo colectivamente en nuestro grupo de lectura en el Centro de Investigación en Comunicación este semestre, invierte un poco el orden en el que se discute usualmente y se entiende la relación entre democracia y desinformación. No es solo que las llamadas noticias falsas afectan el estado de la democracia, como se escucha frecuentemente, sino que tenemos desinformación por el estado de la democracia, o lo que el autor llamaría falsa democracia. En la charla de hoy, el profesor Gilroy-Ware combina las perspectivas que ensayó en ambos libros en un relato sobre las relaciones que existen entre las noticias falsas, la economía de la atención y hasta aplicaciones como TikTok. Nuevamente, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos, y nuevamente gracias al profesor Gilroy-Ware por sacar de su tiempo, por estar acá. Ojalá lo pudiéramos darle la bienvenida en persona, pero bueno, también estar aquí nos da la oportunidad de compartir esta actividad con personas de otros países que sabemos que están conectadas y que se inscribieron para la actividad. Así que también bienvenidas a esta lección inaugural del segundo semestre, y le cedemos el micrófono y la pantalla a Marcus.
Muchas gracias. La primera cosa que yo quería decir es gracias no solamente por la invitación, por hablar con ustedes hoy, pero también por la invitación, por hayan leído y discutido mi trabajo. Y esto es siempre un honor muy grande. Entonces, gracias por eso. Lo siento no poder hablar solamente en español hoy. Mi español no es conversacional, pero no es fluente, no es suficiente para presentar mi trabajo. Espero que la próxima vez será mejor. Yo podría en este caso hablar enteramente en español, pero hoy yo voy a presentar en inglés, pero preguntas podemos hablar en los dos idiomas después. Entonces, gracias a todos ustedes. Okay, so I was going to speak to you about this title, La sociedad de la desinformación, afectividad, atención y vigilancia en la esfera pública del capitalismo tardío. Or as I'm saying, the disinformation society, affect, attention, and surveillance in the late capitalist public sphere. Now, I like to, because sitting around talking about disinformation on social media can be quite fun. But I think that before we do that, it's really important for us to put ourselves through our paces a bit and do a bit of work to explore the kind of which conceptual frameworks we're going to use to try to make sense of the various problems that I identify and I think that we can see are apparent in the world as far as the ways that misinformation and disinformation arise in social media and in these kinds of platforms. So let's do some work. Now, I thought actually a good place to start would be to break down some of these. This is a rather wordy title that I've chosen. I thought we could break it down into some kind of constituent parts and try to make sure that we are clear about exactly what we mean by all of these kind of terms. So annoyingly, my arrow is staying there. But let's look at them all together. So we have the public sphere. It's already quite a loaded title. Then we had this idea of late capitalism, again, contested, differently periodized. And then we have these kinds of, I think, really important concepts that, again, are sort of being brought together in this context. So affect, which you hear people talk about a lot. Attention, which I think is also super important. And surveillance. So I'm going to try and kind of talk about these things individually, and then hopefully we can put them together and think about what they mean for the kinds of phenomena and problems that are arising, particularly in the transfer of information across social media networks. And really, in a way, the head of my title, the disinformation society, is where we'll end up. So we'll kind of go backwards and we'll end up with, is there such a thing as the disinformation society? But in a way, this is kind of the least important part because it's just the sort of umbrella under which everything else sits. So, I mean, probably all of you are very familiar with some of the critiques of the idea of the public sphere. You don't need me to tell you it comes from Habermas in the 60s, and it's a very specific and narrow concept. And that's something that Habermas himself has, criticized himself for, and lots of other people have also criticized him for that as well. He was speaking specifically about the kind of changes to power and the ways that, decision-making and public discourse would interrelate. And it was a sphere of, private households come together as a public to discuss and to reflect upon the exercise of power as power kind of changed the form that it took. So quite a specific phenomenon, but the idea of the public sphere obviously has been used a lot since then, sometimes in a careful way that acknowledges these flaws, and sometimes in a rather careless way that imagines simply that there is a thing called the public sphere, but there isn't. Actually, what we have is really sort of public spheres. And I think that's a much more kind of interesting and useful way of looking at it. We have multiple overlapping fora. And that's kind of, I think anyone who's familiar with looking at kind of informational transfer on social media is going to already be familiar with this. I mean, what we have to be careful about, again, jumping too neatly onto the bandwagon of, filter bubbles and echo chambers. I think it's fair to say that there are fragmented, overlapping, incomplete conversations taking place, and that they have this kind of overlapping overlapping quality to them, and some of them can be more exclusive, some of them could be more normative. I particularly like Nancy Fraser's idea of subaltern counterpublics. Hers is one of the more important and I think complete critiques of the idea of the public sphere. Now, this is all well and good. Why is the public sphere important? I think one of the things for me, particularly if you look at the kind of rather invisible way that politics has changed and political economy has changed in the last, 80 years or thereabouts, and the increasingly implicit, disguised, obfuscated way that process has occurred, that we need to be looking at the kind of spaces, platforms, infrastructures, whatever you want to call them, where conversations about our democratic realities take place anywhere in the world, and actually in a planetary context as well. One of the political scientists whose work really inspires me and has given me a lot to think about is Wendy Brown, and I think she put it really well. In fact, I quoted this in my book also, when she said that democratic self-rule must be consciously valued, cultured, and tended by a people seeking to practice it, and must vigilantly resist myriad economic, social, and political forces threatening to deform or encroach upon it. So there are very important conversations that need to happen for democracy to stay alive, right? Democracy is not something that can be taken for granted. It's like a garden. If we want it to be, beautiful and to give us fruits and vegetables and flowers and all the rest of it, we have to tend it, right? And look after it. Otherwise it will be full of weeds and toxins and God knows what. And so part of the way we tend our democracy and value it consciously is through our conversations which we have, which of course involve having conversations with people we don't know, and in these kinds of overlapping, complicated, sometimes subaltern, sometimes not public spheres. So that's the first bit of the context here, which I think is really important for how we go about this, right? There was a sort of dismissive way of talking about social media in the past, that it was kind of, really just what people had for breakfast, or, pictures of cats or whatever. And I think those people have been comprehensively proven wrong. There are very, very important processes and conversations happening. I'll come back to the question of why we study social media in a little bit. But I think that, as long as these conversations are happening there, it's something we need to take seriously. Okay, so then we move on a little bit from this public spheres question, which already maybe gives us something in which to ground our inquiry, and look also at the question of late capitalism. Somehow I feel there's a connection between late capitalist media and late capitalist junk food, which is why I put this image. But again, late capitalism is one of those concepts that's not, completely sort of pinned down. It appears a lot in the works of Adorno in the Frankfurt School and that kind of thing. And then, of course, you have Frederick Jameson writing later about exactly where it starts or doesn't start, exactly what it is or is not. And I guess I leave this as an open question for us to think about, because, with my students, I torment them with the question of postmodernism as well, actually, which I think is really key in studying media, right? And of course, if we look at the work of Mark Fisher and many other people, we can see that even the distinction between modernism and postmodernism starts to break down. You have postmodernism and all the rest of it. And there's a question of how much distance we have from the particular historical, political conditions and moments that might have given rise to a shift towards something called late capitalism. Do we call it, do we consider the moment, in a European context at least, one often considers the moment after the Second World War as being a moment possibly where a different kind of order was established. In trying to understand some of the, related concepts like neoliberalism, people often look to the sort of late 70s, early 80s. Sometimes people look at the shocks of the early 70s, gold, the gold standard, or the oil crises, things like this. The truth is, we know that something is happening to capitalism kind of globally. We know that capitalism in 2021 is not the same as capitalism in 1971, is not the same as capitalism in 1941, is not the same as capitalism in 1901. We know that some shift is taking place, but it's very hard to generalize about that. And I think that's kind of an interesting conversation in itself that fits into the Wendy Brown stuff about, well, how do we talk about, with others, especially over long distances, about what is happening. And of course, the environmental catastrophe, the environmental crisis that we're seeing only adds kind of new urgency and new dimensions to that. But whatever is happening, whatever this shift is, and wherever you start it, there's something kind of quite dark about it, which I think is kind of particularly characteristic, right? It's intensely postmodern, right? There's this kind of endless rehearsal of the past. Every meme quickly goes meta and becomes about itself. There's this kind of obsession really with the aesthetics of the past, whereas at the same time, this is kind of nihilistic, kind of the future doesn't really matter, we can't do anything about it anyway, kind of almost laughing about the crises. I mean, maybe this is particularly in the UK, but not laughing about the crises, but laughing as a sign of desperation and hopelessness. So that kind of making into pastiche or even of parody of something that's very real, but completely removes the possibility of understanding our own future, I think is one of the concepts or one of the kind of hallmarks of this kind of, perhaps we could call it very late capitalism. Of course, part of that is that there's this epidemic of mental health dysfunction, which I think is very interesting. And, what's particularly interesting, to me at least, is that I've been focusing on affect and attention for years, really. And then I realized after that in terms of trying to understand mental health crises and many of the other kind of forms of neurodiversity that can represent, learning difficulties of various kinds, that, it's interesting that we see a huge amount of affective disorders, right? So depression and anxiety. And then we see attention deficit being a huge thing in education as well, and myself included. So I think that there's kind of something really interesting, maybe some work to be done in connecting these kind of, obviously work has been done connecting the affective disorders with the central role of affect, going back through Raymond Williams and structures of healing and all that kind of stuff. But also, I think also on attention deficit and how that relates to the kind of attention economy. So there's something, I think we can sort of trace some of the hallmarks of this very late capitalism through that. I think it's really important as well that there's something called the narcissism of the present, which is this idea that whatever we are experiencing right now is new and has never happened before. And I think it's really important to remember in that context that we're dealing with things that are intensifying and worsening. And sometimes that change in degree can become a change in kind. And that change in kind can be new. But at the same time, what we're dealing with is not a completely kind of new phenomenon. It's not a new animal. We've seen aspects of it for years. We can tell a story in my book. In the first chapter, I tell the story of how I think all of this stuff, from the environmental crisis to populism to many other aspects of this landscape, how they develop. So the neoliberal logics have simply, have intensified, and whether you think that constitutes a change in kind from a change in degree, I think is an open question. Speaking of neoliberalism, I wanted to just kind of also reflect on that. Again, this is something that's notoriously difficult to define. It's, I think, rightly used to describe certain modes of governmentality, right? So outsourcing, public-private partnerships, privatization, deregulated commerce, competition as a kind of overriding logic, marketplace. Milton Friedman claimed to believe that marketplaces would bring about peace and brotherhood, I think he said, throughout the world. So bringing that squarely into the heart of government is one way of thinking about what neoliberalism is, but it's not the only one, right? Then you have kind of, related to the Friedman stuff, you have kind of a relativist market supremacy. That's what I would call it. So you're basically saying symbolic value and, you know, other forms of value only exist to the extent that they can be recognized by some kind of exchange, that value can be converted to some kind of exchange value. The environment is valuable because we can buy and sell it, or perhaps even we can use the buying and selling to protect the environment. If you think about carbon trading, these kinds of things, right? But there's sense that market value is everything. So that's relativist market supremacy, which I would say is another facet of neoliberalism that's not necessarily the same as bringing it into the heart of government, but obviously we can see how the two are related. And then in a way, what I'm kind of most interested in is the kind of social and cultural assumptions that neoliberalism is said to represent, although the word, because it's got so many meanings, is kind of unsatisfactory. But I think, you know, this kind of way of looking at neoliberalism as something that's kind of a cultural mode in which we're evaluating people's worth according to their life circumstances. We judge people who still live at home with their parents as failures or whatever, this kind of stuff. We say, look at these immigrants, they're not sufficiently entrepreneurial, they're receiving handouts, all this kind of stuff. This is a kind of softly neoliberal way of looking at the problem. I like Wendy Brown's approach. She just says, well, and also Stuart Hall does this, neoliberalism is several things at once. It doesn't have to just be one thing. Brown says neoliberalism is at once a distinctive mode of reason over the production of subjects, a conduct of conduct, and a scheme of evaluation. It names a historically specific economic and political reaction against Keynesianism and democratic socialism, as well as a more generalized practice of economizing spheres and activities heretofore governed by other tables of value. So she's kind of got all of the things that I said in this quote, but she's saying it doesn't matter, we can call it neoliberalism and it can mean all of these things. But I do want to focus on this cultural and kind of normative dimension of it. How does it affect, you know, if it's just a political system or an economic system, then if we're not involved in politics or economics, in theory, it shouldn't touch us, but it does. It can be kind of softly guiding the way that we behave towards one another, the way that we discuss things, the way unconsciously we're thinking about things. And when it comes to those conversations that we're having about democracy, about our survival, it can interfere with those as well. And that's, you know, I mean, that's basic historical materialism, really. But I think that's the place where I feel like we need to focus. And so we can go all the way back to Marx, actually. We can say, you know, we can read this, you know, the bourgeoisie has left no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, callous cash payment, and resolved worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. Mark Fisher, of course, well known for talking about these things as well. He says neoliberalism has sought to eliminate the very category of value in the ethical sense, kind of echoing Marx and Engels there. Bifo Berardi also, the economy has taken the place of the universal grammar, traversing the different levels of human activity. In my work, I try to kind of sidestep the hair splitting that happens in relation to the term neoliberalism and use a different term, market-driven society, which I draw from the work of the economist Colin Lees, who talks about market-driven politics. And I felt it's not even just politics anymore. It's the captive status of an entire society, from government to popular culture, to health, to creativity, to love, to our collective political imagination, to the future itself, within a paradigm in which free trade, the pursuit of profit, and the private accumulation of wealth have been made into the supreme and dominant principles of that society, far beyond the capitalisms of old. So that's, I think, a really necessary kind of introductory look at the world we're in. I don't study these things because I'm interested in the technology of social media platforms or, you know, the kind of romance of what it means to be a journalist, or the, you know, glitz and glamour of being a creative media maker, or any of those kinds of things. I study these things because I feel that we need to understand something about where we are going to go, and how the process of taking back our future and ensuring our survival can be protected, can be made to happen. And the same is true, you know, in terms of like in terms of studying social media, right? Neoliberalism must be studied because it is in everything. Social media must be studied for similar reasons, right? So let's talk about this one a little bit. I have 3 reasons. I'm not saying they're the only 3 reasons, but I think they're enough for them to be the only 3 if we wanted them to be, and perhaps we can find some others as well. I think the obvious one, and this is kind of connects all the way back to what people have been saying about the internet for years in a way. The first one is scale. You simply can't reach that number of people with very many other ways, right? I mean, you know, international football tournaments don't even reach the same number of people as a social media platform can, right? Second is the political economy of what social networks actually represent in the context of everything I've just been saying. And finally, the basic design of them as well in that political economic context, I think is really important in terms of what they do. Excuse me. So let's talk about scale. So, I mean, scale, you know, Facebook is edging up towards 3 billion monthly active users. There's simply, as I said, nothing else that enables this kind of reach. And of course, you have all of the different, you know, social segmentations, language barriers. You know, my argument is not that there's any singular one thing that all 3 billion monthly active users are looking at, but simply to say that if you have 3 billion monthly active users, then, you know, certainly an audience of millions and millions is a completely unsurprising and normal thing, or can be. We still highly valorize it, call it going viral or whatever, but the truth is it's a commonplace. So I think that scale is really interesting, because I think if you're talking about social and political change, if you're talking about kind of steering the ship of human civilization away from the iceberg, then actually scale is really potentially really important for that, but also potentially really damaging to that as well. The second reason, I think, is the political economy side. As I said, social media platforms are, to me, some of the most capitalist infrastructures ever built. I bring you this Marx and Engels quote again, just reminding you that that's what they're doing, right? They embody a logical development and intensification of the tendencies of capitalism, really, but especially of late capitalism. Further commodification, further globalization, more ruthless, more nihilistic, more reaching further into the lives of users in particular, through privacy, you know, being completely nonchalant about privacy. So I think that aggression in the platforms and the ways that's, you know, especially more recently, many of the Silicon Valley co-founders, engineers, other people who have been involved in creating these platforms have more or less confessed to the fact that they knew that these platforms would be exploiting the vulnerabilities in human psychology. And I think that that's, you know, that's really an illustration of exactly, I guess, how I see this kind of nihilistic late capitalism. Yeah, we knew people were vulnerable. We knew that what we were doing is wrong. We did it anyway for the money. Sorry, you know what I mean? That's quite an important aspect of why they have to be studied, I think, as well. They are not separate. We always make technology into a kind of exceptional thing, but it really isn't. It's very, very contiguous with the history of capitalism. It's a logical development of what we had before. And then finally, of course, is the design. And I've written about something that I call timeline media. I think, again, this is a really kind of, to me, a really interesting aspect of the way that social media platforms complicate those conversations that we're having. And this kind of goes to the heart of what's interesting about them. So in the context of all that political economic stuff, we know that, for instance, the inventor of the like button is one of those people who said, sorry, I didn't mean to hurt, you know, the world. I didn't mean to kind of do this much damage. The inventor of infinite scrolling also says something similar. Right, so there's always been a question, actually, in terms of the relationship between, you know, technology and capitalism, as to create technologies is a matter of power, right? So if you're empowered to create technologies, that's already says something about where you sit, and what the technology enables says something about, you know, what your priorities are, I think, what your imagination wants. But this kind of question of design, and particularly of timeline media, is also crucial because it does represent some novelty, I think, some newness in the way that media are consumed and experienced and felt. So timeline media is my way of kind of conceptualizing that. It is, for me, the linear progression through algorithmically curated media, right? It doesn't matter whether it's TikTok scrolling, whether it's Instagram scrolling, whether it's YouTube. At the end of the YouTube video, there's a suggestion for, you know, 3, 5, however many more YouTube videos. This sense of the algorithm tries to figure out what you want and then feed you more of it. But in so doing, probably exposes you to things you wouldn't otherwise have found. In doing so, it is commanding your attention, and it's also, you know, exposing you to possibly more extreme things that you didn't know you liked, but now you know you like them. So it's actually kind of conditioning your imagination and sense of possibility and of those kinds of things as well. The question of effect and media effects is a huge one in itself, and not something that we really had space for today. Just checking the time, actually. I hope someone will send me a message if I'm running out of time. But anyway, so this question of the design I think is really, really important. So we've got those three things: scale, the political economic dimensions, and the design itself in that context. But I want to move back to my the three things in my subtitle: affect, attention, and surveillance. Because I think now, in the context of all of what I've said, hopefully we can see how already they're kind of bubbling to the top, these things. So I don't intend them to be an exclusive list of the necessary components. Again, this is just my suggestion. I think these would be three good things to work with, but there are definitely others. You know, sociality, I think, is really important. You know, you could say, well, affect is part of psychology. There are other parts of psychology that are also useful. So let's work with these three and see what things we can uncover, or at least that's what I say to myself when I'm working on this. So I think a really important thing here when we're looking at these three things, affect, attention, and surveillance, is that they all in some way kind of go to the core of this interesting relationship between the individual and the structure, the group, the world at large. And so that's very, very kind of important, because the technology enables a certain kind of personalization that caters to and exploits individual experiences and subjectivities, at the same time as using widespread cultural and political conditions, and of course technologies at scale to do that. So that relationship between individual and the structure at large is, I would say, affect and attention and surveillance all really kind of have both at work in them, and that's really important. So let's talk about affect first. Now, obviously, you know, social scientists and psychologists have been using affect to try to understand the world for a really long time. It's a word that means lots of different things. I think people usually rightly talk about Raymond Williams' idea of structures of feeling, the sense that like the pervasiveness of how what we feel about the world is kind of encoded into, built into the way, the workings of the world. I particularly am a fan of the work of Mark Fisher also, and the concept of depressive hedonia for me has been really important in trying to make sense of the kind of affective relationship to social media. So for those of you who haven't read Mark Fisher, his basic idea is that in general, when we are faced with a depressive condition or clinical depression, we experience what he calls, well, what is generally called anhedonia, right? You're so depressed and fed up that you're unable to enjoy things that are pleasurable. And what he noted and described was this idea that actually in some cases, societies in which depression is prevalent seem to include an escalation, a proliferation of the ways that simple pleasures can be obtained, whether it's kind of, you know, confectionery, pornography, staying up all night watching YouTube, you know, junk food, etc. So that's the kind of response. And so what I did in my first book was to take that and compare it to actual kind of psychological studies where, you know, rats in mazes kind of stuff, where you see that, for example, rats that are depressed will tend to undereat, but when there's highly palatable food available, then they'll tend to gorge themselves on sugar, fat, salt, and things that rats like the taste of in particular. And the same is true in people. So actually there's some science to depressive hedonia also. And I tried to kind of map that onto the ways that I saw people using media, which I think, you know, a few years later on from that, I think we can see, especially given the proliferation of platforms like TikTok, or the way that YouTube has changed the affordances built into its platform, that, you know, there's something to that perhaps. I really also like the work of Karen Vahl-Jorgensen at the University of Cardiff, who's kind of talked a lot about the design of these systems as affective and emotional furniture in a way, like thinking about it like public space. Public space has a way of being tied to the prevailing ideology of a particular society where it was constructed. So for instance, fascist architecture or whatever. And so she claims that, well, actually, if you look at the design of these systems, they are designed affectively. And that's, you know, I think that's important when we're talking about affect. We have to tie what I said earlier about design into this. But particularly, I guess I want to leave us with depressive hedonia before I move on, because I think that that's kind of a really helpful, you know, compass for navigating this. Yes, okay, I'll move on. So the next one, of course, being attention. I think it's really hard for, I mean, I see a lot of articles out there that say things like the business model is data, it's data. And I've just never really bought that. I think the business model is showing you things. If you are paying attention to me all the time, then I can show you things. And the things that I show you, a bit like kind of, you know, the basic idea of superstructural kind of reinforcement, right? If I'm able to show you things that will have an effect on you in some way, then I'm able to nudge you in one direction or another. I'm able to get you to buy things. Everyone was fine with that, right? And then with Cambridge Analytica, you saw as soon as the same business model showing you things was used to try to get people to vote this way or that, or to not vote at all in some cases, there was a scandal, because actually the business model of showing people things and showing them as much as possible and getting as much of their eyeball time in a way as possible turns out to be a rather insidious one. And, you know, part of that is enabled by the affordance of the smartphone. I don't know if you have, you know, taken the time to look at the settings in your own smartphones to see how much time you're looking at the screen every day, or, you know, I get a weekly summary that tells me what my average is. But if your average is somewhere around 3 hours a day, which you may be surprised to find it is, because that is the average for most people, that over an average lifetime, that amounts to 11 years. So there's quite a lot of like source material for this new commodity of attention. And in, you know, true to form, that's exactly what the businesses of you know, social media platforms have sprung up to exploit, really. So that's the attention business model. Is showing you things. And what's really interesting is that this is growing still, right? So you'll notice that this quote comes from 2017. Also written in 2017 is this really kind of interesting little snippet of information I found from John Lanchester, the British novelist. He wrote in the London Review of Books, as Facebook has grown, its users' reliance on it has also grown. The increase in numbers is not, as one might expect, accompanied by a lower level engagement. More does not mean worse, or worse at least from Facebook's point of view. On the contrary, in the far distant days of October 2012, when Facebook hit 1 billion users, 55% of them were using it every day. At 2 billion, 66% are. So, what could we put that down to? I mean, I think the obvious thing is to say, well, they've tuned the machine, right? They've built in more of these kinds of features that use affect to garner attention. Use your affective responses to make you want to keep checking, to make you want to spend longer on the app, to make you want to look at other apps, to receive things that are sent to you, to send things on, etc. It's too simple to say that, you know, we're just robots that do what we're told. Obviously, there is some agency, but remember, they only need 1 or 2% for a big win, and here they have 11%. It doesn't have to be everybody all the time being kind of manipulated entirely. It can just be a little bit, and that's already, you know, significant growth for them. So attention is the commodity then, right? And I mean, how dark and nihilist is that human attention, eyeball time, becomes something that can be bought and sold and traded and targeted at you using data. Which brings me to my third. In this case, the other two I think are commodities. I think affect is a commodity. I think attention is a commodity. I don't think surveillance is. Surveillance is then the process that kind of collects the third commodity, which is data, right? So we have this kind of, I mean, I'll together in a minute, I'll put them all together as a process and we can see how they fit together. But I think perhaps that is probably already coming together in your minds or already did before. But suffice it to say that as we're scrolling through this timeline media and we're responding to things that have some kind of affect on us, or some effect on us rather, data about what we like, what we spend time looking at, what we comment on, you know, how far through the video we get, etc., is being collected, and that then is used. So it isn't surveillance in the kind of necessarily like strictly Foucauldian sense of exercising power over us by surveying us. It's surveillance in a much more, I think, kind of creepy way that's just really collecting data about us so that this process of commodifying our attention and exploiting our psychological vulnerabilities can be made more efficient and made more productive and made more profitable. It's a sort of surveillance into your brain and your thinking and your affects in order to kind of be able to be more kind of even more invasive. And it is a circular process, as I'll show you in a second. So Nick Srnicek writes really well about this. Kind of a long quote, so perhaps it's unnecessary for me to read it, but I will just read the end. That it's not just about collecting data. He says, and I quote, "Key to revenues is not just the collection of data, but also the analysis of data. Advertisers are interested less in unorganized data and more in the data that give them insights or match them to likely consumers," right? That's what, if I'm a client of Facebook, that's what I'm paying them for. So having spoken a lot, I thought it would be good to bring them together into this kind of, circular process, so we can kind of see how it all. The bit that I didn't talk about was interaction, just because A, there's not really time, B, we kind of know that bit. That's the social media that they claim to be. That's why they call themselves social media. But I see something, I like it, I send it, or I may just like it, and people will see that I liked it anyway. So interaction can be any gesture, really, that results from our having paid attention to something. And of course, that is then measured through surveillance, and then that's the data and the analysis of it that comes from that surveillance then drives us to see things which are then more affectively stimulating, and the process starts again. So in all of this, we then have to understand, what I think of as being factual content exposure. Right, I work with a lot of journalists and people trying to make sense of what's happening to journalism and the kind of great disaster in a way that has befallen journalism. We could get into the question of what are facts, or do facts exist, or intermediation, all of that kind of stuff. But I think really we don't have to. I want to suggest three possible, or really two in a way, possible kind of modes of factual content exposure that take place. One is the intentional. In other words, you have a question, you're looking for the answer to that question. A friend bets you, what's the capital of, what's the capital of France if it's America? They don't know that kind of stuff. And then so you go looking for the answer, you find it. Fairly uninteresting. Google has already enclosed and commodified all of that stuff years ago, right? And then mix ads in with that because it's still attention economics. And then we have incidental, which I think is more interesting, and that's really where my work focuses. So incidental factual content exposure is what you encounter while you're looking for something else, or and that something else is key. You may be looking for something else, as so far as like, you may have a specific question for which you're looking for an answer in the intentional mode. But then in the course of looking for that, you encounter something new, something unrelated, something tangentially related. These are, I suppose, what we could, they're really the hybrid. And then sometimes you're not looking for a specific informational goal at all. You're actually just looking for some kind of distraction. You have hedonic motivations. You are feeling low and you want to regulate your mood. You have an essay to write and you're procrastinating, whatever it is, escape from a mental health condition. And so all of these are motivations as well. And I think, again, going back to the question of individual experience and motivations, and then looking at that in the context of broader structures, I think it's kind of, I've lost my train of thought there, but I think it's really important to kind of consider that individual motivations have to be kind of properly worked out and understood, and all of these kinds of things that have been so often overlooked in at least of journalism studies and things like that, like mood management, distraction, procrastination. Sometimes your journalism is not going to be encountered by people who are real kind of, news fiends who want to know everything about what's happening in the world. They're going to be encountered by people who are just aimless and not sure what they're looking for. As this, was the case with earlier forms of journalism being found and encountered perhaps on TV or in magazine or newspaper forms, or think about the coffee shops of England in the 19th century, etc. That there could be a great degree enthusiasm about that, but actually there doesn't have to be. It can be completely, not exactly random, but certainly incidental as to what you find. So then we have exposure, and of course, exposure is also conditioned by a number of other things. So you have pre-selected personalization, which is where the algorithm is feeding you things. You have self-selected personalization, which is based on who you have followed, subscribed to. You know, we're being told on YouTube all the time, like, comment, subscribe, right? So these are the kind of self-selected things. Now we have we've turned on or off certain, you know, sources of content in our timeline. So what happens when a person who's just bored at home or depressed or lonely or something is then exposed to ostensible, factual content in a world that has long decided that exchange value is the only form of value, that things like truth, therefore, are only valuable insofar as they can be measured in some sort of market terms, which of course they can't, and a world in which, you know, your own actual attention and your affects are valuable commodities, right? So maybe the truth isn't so valuable or can't be kind of so clearly seen in market terms, but your attention definitely is, and is being exploited on a completely unprecedented scale, and your affects are being used in conjunction with surveillance to make that process as efficient as possible. This can only lead to a huge proliferation of potentially misleading content, especially when, you know, combined with the architectures of user-generated content and so forth. So, I mean, it's very hard, even though I study this, to then go back and find a complete kind of suite of examples. But I thought I would show you some that have some kind of relatively recent link to what's happening in the world, just to give you an idea. And we can sort of chat about some of these maybe in the discussion afterwards. But so you will see, I've seen that the end of Hurricane Ida has hit New York. The last time a hurricane hit New York was in October 2012. And at that time, I was very interested I was just getting interested in this stuff, really. And I noted a huge circulation of images like this around social media. It was mostly Facebook then. Both of these images, of course, are completely false, but both quite believable in their own way. And so, of course, there were people who were completely misled by them and taken in by them, because, you know, they're quite convincing. If you've never taken the subway in New York, at least, then this might be convincing. Anyone who has knows that it's filthy and that they wouldn't leave the lights on if it were full of water. But you can imagine that in a moment of crisis, when, you know, things appear to be exceptional and at some sort of rupture from the past, we don't necessarily always have a clear imagination of how these things would look. So then along comes the image, and boom, and all of the things that I've just been describing kick in to say, well, this is cool. This is getting my attention. This is stimulating my imagination. This is you know. So this is the top one here. It's just, I mean, it's just completely fake, right? The diver has been cut out and stuck in carefully with the bubbles as well. The whole thing has been made blue. It's been blurred. This is a very, very deliberate attempt to mislead from one person's perspective. But then when it comes into your timeline, as you're scrolling through it, you're not necessarily, you might say, oh, that's fake, but you might send it to a bunch of your friends and think it's real, at which point it becomes misinformation, and people are just kind of, you know, hearing from somebody they trust that that's happened. And then the third possibility is that we actually don't know or care particularly whether it's fake or not. The fun part is discussing with our friends whether we think it's fake or not, and it becomes a social moment, you know, a point of social connection. I might send it to my dad and he'll say, oh, that's totally fake. And I'll be like, oh yeah, I see what you mean, oops, you know, or something like that. And the one down here, I think, is from a film, but it's a similar idea, right? We can argue about whether it's fake, or some people will be vulnerable to that particular misinformation, and so they will see it and believe it's real. Others will have seen the film that it comes from, and so they won't be so vulnerable to it. But I think the question of vulnerability in relation to images like this is a really important one, especially when we ground it in the political economic context that I have been describing. Another recent one, I mean, pretty classic example really, but a highly recent one was this. I don't know if you saw it, but there was this footage going around that the Taliban had hung some poor man from a helicopter above Kandahar and were sort of flying around as he hung from the bottom. Now, I'm not for 1 minute trying to exonerate or defend the Taliban, but in this particular instance, it turned out to be completely untrue, and that actually even a careful examination of the footage up close showed that the man was alive and waving cheerfully to people on the ground. And yet a US-American politician by the name of Ted Cruz picked this up and tweeted it, and later had to delete the tweet because actually it seems it was not real. This is exactly the kind of problem. By the time that's gone out, a large number of people who have seen the first tweet may have made up their mind as a result of that, particularly if it is highly affective and disturbing in the way that this appeared to be. And yet, they may not see the second time around. They may not see the clarification, right? Corrections and clarifications are almost always more boring than seeing something pretty sickening to begin with, even if it turns out it's not real. Another example, one that I used in my book, but it's such a good example that I wanted to kind of bring it in again. This is sort of deliberate also. And again, it fulfills this dual role of being disinformation and misinformation at the same time, because it starts off as something that's deliberately misleading. We think, I mean, this is not a lithium mine. Actually, lithium normally is not mined. It's extracted from flat, salt flats in Peru and places like that. And so to include an image like this of something that is not a lithium mine at all is, one would expect, a deliberately misleading thing to do. However, this person who made the entire image here may have been told that this was a picture of a lithium mine. So we don't know at which point something is, cynical or deliberately misleading, and at what point it passes into the realm of misinformation, where in fact it's just people's basic poor understanding of the world. Let's not forget that 7% of US Americans believe that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. So, it's funny, but there's also serious vulnerability here to that kind of mistaken belief. And then, of course, these things being assembled in this way, you've got the font here, impact regular in white with a black background, the kind of comparison of two images in a way that reveals inconsistency of some kind. I mean, this is classic media trope that people will recognize in its own way, and that garners a certain form of trust from people who have already decided that the mainstream media is corrupt, right? So, but here's something you could trust because it encodes those kind of tropes of like the people's media in some way, all implicitly, I would say. Another example, I think, we can't not talk about COVID, particularly as, this is where the overlapping forms of health, whether it's mental health, literacy, and actual public health, can all combine. We saw a lot at the beginning of the pandemic, especially of false cures, garlic water. People thought that cocaine in France, people thought cocaine could fix COVID, obviously hydroxychloroquine, and many others as well, right? And so each time one of those things is out there and being spread around in this way where we kind of we believe it because we want to believe it, but it's been created originally probably for some kind of, with some kind of menace or malice. These I do think that they pose a real danger, but I think often when people say that, they're saying so in the context that the danger, the blame for this then lies purely at the door of social media corporations. I think that the blame lies at the door of social media corporations insofar as they, as I have said, escalate the tendencies of capitalism generally into, means by which this happens for their own private gain. But actually, really, for us to understand this properly, we need to look more broadly. We need to look at the history of capitalism. We need to look at the kind of other forms of rapid kind of and ruthless commodification that are occurring in the world. And if we do, we'll also see some of the mechanics that are destroying our environment and rendering our healthcare systems kind of unprepared for pandemics are actually outcomes of the same process that also leaves us completely ill-equipped to deal with all of the disinformation that's coming from social networks, and of course that makes the social networks themselves more or less inevitable. So the disinformation society then is not a society in which misinformation and disinformation are explicit or hegemonic, but one in which they are unavoidable, natural, and entirely normalized. And to me, the logics of commodified affect and attention completely reconfigure the value of media away from its, truth for its own sake, because the truth is important, or information for its own sake, but towards media forms whose informational content is mediated by affect, attention economics, and surveillance. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Marcus, por esta excelente presentación. A propósito del tema de la atención, gracias también a todas las personas que han estado poniendo tanta atención en las diferentes plataformas. Nos has dado muchas cosas en qué pensar y hemos recibido, digamos, preguntas orientadas a muchos temas. Pero voy a tratar de organizarlas en 3 grupos y tal vez para no abusar más de tu tiempo podemos contestar o dedicar un pequeño rato a hablar de cada una de estas. El primer grupo de preguntas, y please let me know if you'd like me to translate the questions at some point. El primer grupo de preguntas tiene que ver con cuestiones más teóricas o conceptuales. Una persona lo capturó muy bien o lo resumió muy bien cuando dijo, bueno, pasamos de teorizar sociedades de la información a ahora referirnos a sociedades de la desinformación. Como, ¿qué implicaciones tiene esto a nivel como más teórico y conceptual? O sea, como, ¿qué más podemos decir como de ese desplazamiento conceptual que tiene que ver con pasar de este tipo de términos como sociedad de la información, que se convirtieron como en paradigmas muy importantes en diferentes campos, a ahora conceptualizarlo como en realidad vivimos en sociedades de la desinformación? Las otras 2 grupos de preguntas tienen que ver con, bueno, el rol de las redes sociales o las plataformas tecnológicas en todo esto. Un tercer grupo de preguntas tiene que ver más como con qué soluciones podemos pensar, pero tal vez podemos comenzar con este primer grupo de cuestiones como más teóricas, conceptuales, que están como de fondo en tu propuesta de hacer un cambio, de invertir un poco los modos de análisis al acercarnos a fenómenos como las noticias falsas o la desinformación.
I was wondering, I mean, I followed most of that, but I think there was quite a specific way in which you phrased it, which I just want to make sure I understand the question in the first group, that is, in terms of the more sort of, as you say, more theoretical things. So could you just quickly translate just the nub of the questions, the main kind of point of it, and I will try to answer.
Okay, in English or in Español?
Oh, just a little bit in English so that I can get the main.
Yeah, so one person sort of captured perfectly this sort of theoretical issues when he asked specifically, what does it mean for us theoretically and analytically to shift our analysis or our modes of understanding or paradigms between the information societies, which is how we call this a couple of decades ago, and then turn it into disinformation society. So what kind of theoretical implications does that have? And one question that was also asked as part of this group of questions centered on, are we going back to a sort of a all-powerful media technologies framework again? Is this going back to that sort of modes of explanations that we used to know a couple of decades ago, at least in communication studies, for example?
Those are really good questions. Gracias por las preguntas muy inteligentes. Las implicaciones de the change. I mean, I think you know, I sort of picked out the phrase the disinformation society because I remember, I mean, I was a teenager, you know, really, when the information society was being discussed and used a lot, and there was quite a lot of utopian rhetoric about what that meant. And that did a couple of things that bothered me. One, of course, was the naive utopianism that I think accompanied the sort of 90s liberalism, post-Cold War liberalism and its relationship to technology. If you think about, you know, the first wave of the internet, the launch of Microsoft Windows 95, this kind of Apple, very gleaming kind of recovery of Apple Inc. as a, you know, leader in the sort of consumer computing world, and of course, most of all, the growth of the World Wide Web, all happening at once. There's this kind of really triumphalist approach to the information society, and that, at the time I was a coder, that really bothered me because I felt like, hold on a second, there's so much that's not being talked about here. Again, it might have taken me 20 years to write a book about it, but you know, I kind of think even then I felt like this. First of all, the information society didn't really take into account any of the existing critiques of capitalism that were very important at that time. And so that's a glaring oversight. I felt a lot of those critiques were not kind of visible enough, really. And secondly, I think there's an exceptionalism in the way that we include technology into conversations, broader conversations about what is happening in the world. And we did not, that was not there as well. So the two kind of, I guess, changes that I wanted to make, one was to bring a bit more critique into it. Obviously, disinformation is a negative, whereas information was a positive framing. And the second was to try to mix more our kind of understanding of technology into our understanding of society and politics more generally. I'm not, of course, not the only person to do that. There's lots of people who have done that, and there's a sort of Marxian history of bringing the study of technology together with political economy more broadly. I mean, you can go back to Braverman, people talking about the production line and those kinds of things. But I felt that needed to be done here as well, because there was so much sort of exceptionalist triumphalism happening. Writers like Clay Shirky and stuff, you know, in the sort of mid-2000s, even after the financial crash, and just kind of needed to happen. So I don't know that I can claim that there's a singular, you know, theoretical implication that makes, but I think those are the two main adjustments that needed making and kind of still need making, because it's still an uphill battle a lot of the time. And even when people are critical now of things like fake news or, you know, of social media, again, we often have a very naive understanding of what the companies do, because we don't remember that Facebook, for example, is a hyper-capitalist development. And there's a sense that, well, it's a technology, therefore you can fix it with technological tweaking. You can add labels and buttons and all of these kinds of things, and the problem will go away. And I don't believe that. So I think, you know, it's not so much a kind of theoretical implication as like, it's just a different way of looking at this, which is really focusing on the power and the political and economic first, and then examining the technologies that it produces. And those technologies are hostile to, you know, human flourishing.
Muchas gracias por la respuesta. Creo que el siguiente grupo de preguntas se conecta bien con esto que estás diciendo al final de tu respuesta. So I'll say it first in English and I'll give you some time to think about it and then translate it. But we received other questions that centered specifically on the role of social media. So how do we account for what social media do in this process without blaming them for things that are more structural or more or have deeper causes and roots? How do we understand that? So la siguiente grupo de preguntas tenía que ver más bien con, bueno, ¿cuál es el rol de las redes sociales en todo este proceso? Algunas las enfocaban más en, por ejemplo, los algoritmos, pero en esencia se pregunta si la invitación que nos hace Marcus es a pensar esto como un problema de la democracia más profundo y no necesariamente de la tecnología. Entonces, ¿cuál es el papel o cómo entender el significado específico que tienen las plataformas tecnológicas en esta nueva forma de entender las cosas, más orientada a la propuesta que hace Marcus?
Yo pienso que el rol es como gasolina en el fuego. No son las fuentes de los problemas, pero son they know very well, saben muy bien los efectos de las plataformas. They know that, I mean, Facebook has been told so many times that, you know, there is this problem with their platform, or that this misinformation is spreading, or, you know, that this anti-vax content is being circulated, or that this person is advertising housing only to white people, or, you know, so many problematic things have been brought to light about what is happening on social media platforms, and they don't respond often, or they respond with a PR person and an apology, but they don't take seriously the underlying damage. And okay, maybe that's not a surprise, but I think that tells you something about their role, which is you know, it's a reckless, negligent, greedy mentality that has an exacerbating effect within the kind of broader pathologies of a late capitalist media environment. They're not interested in looking at that environment, and they're not interested in looking at their own exacerbation of those problems. It's kind of just, well, let's carry on doing this for as long as we can.
I'll ask you the question in English first and then go back to Spanish. But some other questions centered on, okay, so if social media companies and platforms don't want to address this seriously, so what solutions do we have? Do those solutions still involve social media? Can we develop social media oriented towards a certain notion of the public good, for example? Is that a way to get out of this situation? Or it takes different kinds of alternatives. So, and if we can still think of a role for social media in a more healthy, not a fake democracy, but a more healthy democracy, what kind of values or agenda should those platforms promote? En español sería como que otro grupo de preguntas tenían que ver como, ok, si las redes sociales, las compañías tecnológicas no quieren asumir ese rol, como explicaba muy bien Marcus en su última respuesta, entonces, como, ¿qué soluciones tenemos? ¿Qué soluciones pasan esas soluciones todavía por diseñar plataformas tecnológicas orientadas hacia alguna visión del bien común? O por el contrario, pasan por cerremos por completo a estas compañías o por lo menos sometámonos a más escrutinio o inclusive a más, digamos, como rupturas organizacionales para que no puedan funcionar de la forma en que lo hacen. Y qué tipo de agendas y de valores deberían promover esas redes sociales si seguimos pensando que pueden tener un rol en una democracia más sana y no una fake democracy como la describe Marcus.
Gracias por la traducción. Well, la pregunta de soluciones es siempre la más difícil. How can we respond to that? I think, well, there are a number of problems with the idea of public social media. First of all is that the public tends to be tied to the state, and the state is a local thing that has in some ways been superseded by exactly this kind of shift towards late capitalism that I started with at the beginning. So, what kinds of transnational organization for the public good in a planetary context do we see? I mean, the UN just about manages to get things done. The World Bank, is that a model that we want to follow? I'm not so sure. NATO, I mean, that's not even global, it's just transnational. The EU, I mean, prior to Brexit, I was a critic of the EU, but as soon as the referendum was on the table, I became a supporter of it. But even there are huge problems in terms of the way its power is organized and made democratic or not. So there doesn't really exist a model for transnational cooperation that would fit the global shape that internet technologies tend to have. So that's one issue. Another issue, of course, is that if you accept my account in which there are exploitative affordances within this platform that are saying, okay, people are lonely, they're miserable, they're bored, they're trying to regulate low mood, they are separated from one another, etc. And they are using these platforms as a means in a compensatory way to try to avoid these, affective disorders and so forth. Then does nationalizing that actually do anything? Or is now some government or transnational organization is making this exploitation instead? You really have to go, if you want solutions, in quite a different direction. You have to sort of start saying, well, in what kind of society, maybe people don't need this. They don't turn to Instagram every time they feel low or lonely. Even if, I don't know, Instagram is owned by the UN, right? That actually maybe there would be other things about human life that would prevent those kinds of patterns from being so familiar to us and so necessary, perhaps, for some of us. And I think that actually raises much more radical questions about how we organize life and how we think about, what it is to thrive, really. So, okay, you asked me what solutions exist. That was really the question. And the question was not what problems are there with the suggestions that were in the question. I think about this every day, and I can't claim that I have, the next book is going to be all the solutions. I mean, I wish. All I can really say is that I think the question of the common good has been sort of systematically rubbed out as part of that kind of those shifts that I described early in my talk. Whether you call it late capitalism or neoliberalism or the market-driven society or whatever, but however you want to name it and talk about it, the question of the common good has gone, and that prevents us from building societies in which we kind of value the idea of looking after one another, value the idea of like your health is my responsibility, my health is your responsibility, these kinds of things, right? And the pandemic has brought us face to face with some of those. I mean, I talk to a lot of different people about this, people well beyond my field. I've had really interesting conversations a few years ago with an imam who had found my work, and we were talking about some of these questions, in relation to his intense knowledge of Islam. I mean, there's lots of different conversations we need to be having with lots of different people from all sorts of different, backgrounds and intellectual commitments as far as what that world looks like. But I guess the thing that I would say is like, in music, they say join a band, right? You can't make it on your own, join a band. And so I really think that, with my with my work within my current department, within my sort of activist work, within my research, whatever, I'm trying to form groups and bonds and networks. And I think that trying to do that as much as possible and to share these conversations and those kinds of possibilities is a good start. And I think that can lead to the building of institutions, which can then try to change the conversation. If you look at how the right and the neoliberals have brought us to this point, a lot of it was very systematic, collective organizing, which was something we associate with the left, but actually, you fund the, intellectuals who are going to develop all of this kind of market thinking, and then you fund the kind of think tanks that are going to develop it, and then you fund the peer, the political lobbying groups that are going to bring it into the corridors of power in some way. All of that is funded. The difference is that the people who want to make the world better normally don't have as much money. So we're always coming from the bottom of the hill rather than down from the top. So it's not as easy. But those are the kinds of things I think about in relation to that problem.
Yeah, we understand the difficulties in responding to such kind of question, but we do appreciate all your thoughts, especially this idea of joining a band. That sounds pretty interesting as well. Do we have time for one final question?
Yes.
Gracias. One final question came in, and that sort of could provide a kind of counter-example to your argument, I guess. So this person asked about the fate of social movements in this, let's say, scenario that you have described. And she was explicitly referring to movements such as, let's say, Me Too, for example. So what happens to those kind of claims in the market-driven economy that you describe? Does it mean that their claims have been commodified as well? Is that the fate that awaits this kind of movements as well? Y para ponerla en español, una última pregunta que Marcus muy amablemente accedió a contestarnos, tiene que ver con un poco con, uno podría decir como un contraejemplo de esto, sí, o tal vez no lo es, pero se refiere específicamente a los movimientos sociales tipo Me Too que han surgido en este escenario, y la pregunta se refiere específicamente a si les espera el mismo desenlace que al que siguen las otras cosas que ocurren en esta democracia orientada hacia la economía, hacia el mercado, perdón, que describe Marcus en su libro. Entonces la pregunta es específicamente, bueno, ¿qué podemos esperar de ese tipo de movimientos? ¿Les espera también ese desenlace en el que sus propias demandas se transforman o se comodifican como como ha sucedido en las otras, digamos, como en otras dinámicas propias a esta falsa democracia?
I hope I haven't sounded too Adornian in my descriptions of this. I don't mean to sound like I think all of this is bad and terrible as far as what happens on social networks. In fact, had I not kind of ran out of time with my talk, I wanted to show you some examples of things that I think are happening that are really quite exciting, actually.
Go ahead, you can do it now. We would love to see it.
Well, before we potentially look at that, I think one of the things that just needs to be borne in mind really is it's neither good nor bad. I mean, I think you could say the same about Me Too, but certainly if you look at last summer at the Black Lives Matter movement, which sort of obviously had been building in the US for a while, since about 2014, but then last year it kind of really exploded and was interpreted in a number of interesting local contexts, and sort of developed greatly. And actually, well, I'll start with something positive. I really felt that the ways that people handled criticism of that movement showed a really healthy, I don't want to sound patronizing of the movement or at all, but I felt that, like, if you look at the kind of conversations about hashtag Black Lives Matter online in sort of maybe 2016, 2017, there was a bit of a kind of, as is so often the case with online conversations about quite polarizing issues, there was a bit of a simplicity going on. If you look at the conversations that were happening last year, in particular, to the ways that people were handling the kind of stupidity of saying things like, well, all lives matter, that actually there was a lot of really intelligent and articulate contributions being made into that conversation. In fact, so many that it became impossible, at least in the observations that I was making, it became impossible for people to respectably say, even in this kind of bottom-up user-generated content world, to say things like all lives matter. Like that became an untenable argument because too many people had too many good arguments against that. So it's sort of the right voices and opinions and analyses prevailed enough to be able to shift that. Whether these things have an offline effect, of course, is a very difficult thing to measure, but one would hope. So there's a positive thing we can say, but there's also, I think, a reality that we cannot expect these things to always, just because it's a trending hashtag or there's a summer of protest or there's a number of weeks in which something like that is happening. I do, for instance, the European Union was amongst those large organizations wishing to appear progressive by stating their commitment to Black Lives Matter. How does that actually convert to a reality, though, in terms of what Northern European affluent social democracies actually look like? Because I don't really see much conversion, to be honest with you. I see brown and black people being allowed to die in the Mediterranean as a matter of policy. I see harshly racist policing continuing across much of Europe. I see a number of other things that tell me that actually the very same European politicians who might be glad and perhaps even genuinely glad to see the European Union stating online its commitment to Black Lives Matter are in denial about, or have not even considered, the fact that that actually Black Lives Matter less still in those very same places, often as a result of deliberate decisions for which they are responsible. So I think Me Too, for example, the impact is clear. The impact is clear that certain things that had been going on for a long time, now there was a new way that they could be discussed and talked about and aired, and that I think that was I do believe that was a transformative conversation, at least here in the UK. I felt that I have a number of friends who felt really emboldened by and seen by that conversation as a result, that they felt they didn't need to tolerate certain things anymore. But on the other hand, does that mean that those abuses don't continue? No. So we can sort of have our cake and eat it maybe and say, well, there are some good benefits that come from this, but there are also some limits to what can be achieved, and that's probably the cautious approach is the best one, I think.
Bueno, creo que eso es un buen momento como para cerrar la conversación de hoy, como ese reconocimiento, digamos, de las tensiones que caracterizan este tipo de fenómenos. Pero no quisiera cerrar esto sin reiterarte, Marcus, el agradecimiento por haber sacado de tu tiempo para estar con nosotros aquí. Esperamos que la próxima sea en persona, pero mientras tanto...
En español también.
Sí, también, bienvenido. Y mientras tanto, te enviamos un abrazo hasta allá y te agradecemos mucho nuevamente el tiempo para compartir con nosotros.
Como he dicho en el inicio, muchas gracias a todos. Es un grande honor.
No, el honor es nuestro. Y muchísimas gracias también a todas las personas que han estado tan atentas a lo largo de esta conversación. Esperamos que les haya dejado tanto como me dejó a mí, por ejemplo, y esperamos que nos podamos volver a conectar pronto para compartir sobre algunas otras temas como este que hemos discutido hoy. Que pasen una muy buena tarde aquí, noche por allá, y nos vemos muy, muy pronto.